Hello, everybody. Welcome to Friday's episode of the Daily Sip. I hope you're all well and had a good week and not being too blown away by the wind that's going on today. Really excited to catch up with a friend and mentor, James Watson O'Neill, who I know from my Scope days. So it's been a while actually since we'd caught up until about, we said 4 or 5 weeks ago, wasn't it, James?
Yeah.
But thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome. It's great to be here. Thanks, Martin.
And we're going to be talking around, I suppose, it's going to be I'm sure we'll go off on lots of interesting tangents and all the rest of it, but you're working at Sign Health, and we're obviously focusing a bit more around what's been going on there and the kind of work that Sign Health does and that you do. But yeah, it'd be great to start if you could just give the viewers a bit of a background bio to yourself. It'd be really helpful.
Sure. Thanks. Well, yes, so I'm Chief Exec at Sign Health. We're the deaf health charity, and I've worked in the charity sector for about 20 years now, although before that I did lots of other stuff, trained to be an actor, failed to be an actor, worked in the private sector in design and marketing and PR and all kinds of other stuff, and then landed in at the NSPCC just 2001. So worked at NSPCC and then worked at Scope, and we met at Scope and did lots of good stuff together there. I was there for a long time, there for 11 years, and joined Sign Health 4 years ago as Chief Exec. So it's my first Chief Exec role, which I'm loving, really enjoying it. Sign Health is a user-led disabled people's organisation. So the majority of our staff and our trustees are deaf people, and I'm deaf. I've become deaf. I've acquired an impairment in my kind of 30s, 40s, and so I've been on a really interesting journey around kind of my own identity as a disabled person, I suppose. And having worked at Scope for so long, that's both like a plus and not a minus, but like a kind of complication in all of that.
Yeah, it's there's a few people I've had on the Daily Sip that don't have an impairment but do amazing stuff, and there's this sort of like, is that okay that I'm involved? And it's not that they don't think it's okay, but it's obviously you get quarters of the disabled community where it's very much that nothing about us without us, and then there's other people that are doing really amazing stuff and they've got an impairment but they've never really spoken about it because they're worried that it's like, it's not about their impairment, it's about their business or their charity and their career and their value, really. And I think that point about identity, whether it's sort of with an impairment or without, and in the inclusion world is quite an interesting one. And I wonder why people feel, almost all sides of the fence feel a bit like not sure if they've got that right angle or not. It's really interesting.
It's so interesting, and I think it's definitely part of the kind of evolution of the community and the movement. I think we see that in the deaf community a lot. There's a really positive and encouraging element to the current conversation in the community that's about whether ideas of being deaf enough should be kind of dropped, and people should be welcomed into the deaf community regardless of their experience. That's a challenging thing in the deaf community because it's such a big community of people. Millions and millions of people have some degree of deafness, hearing loss, choose your own language, but only a small minority of people are profoundly deaf from birth and use sign language as a first language, for example. So one of the challenges in my role, I think, is that, Sign Health, we're a proud deaf organisation, and for us that means that sign language is our first language as an organisation, and we are supporting pretty much exclusively, but there's some grey stuff at the edges, but pretty much exclusively we support deaf people who use sign language. So we're focused very much on a particular part of the deaf community, and so my identity as a leader, as a disabled person, but I'm kind of coincidentally deaf in my role because my organisation doesn't focus on people who have impairments similar to me. So it's complicated. I think it's more interesting to me than it is to anybody else. But I need to make sense of it, I think, because of all of the sensitivities there are around politics in the disability community. And from what I learned, I think, from working with lots and lots of disabled people at Scope, and I'm also a trustee of 3 different disability charities, so I'm really aware of those issues and how important they are to some people. So they're important to me too, definitely.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the sort of context of what we're talking about identity is with disability, but within a professional capacity. And I think it's a tangent from that point, but around identity with disability is just a generally interesting concept, because it's like, for me, how much has my being born with spinal muscular atrophy defined part of my life or my personality? I can't, get away that I need a wheelchair and I need a care team, and sometimes I have to watch my health in the winter, all that kind of stuff. But then it's to not let it be everything about your identity, because I'm a guy and I like football and I like travel, and that's separate. And so I think,
Sure.
On a professional and a personal level, it's how much we embrace and almost have pride of that difference, but then to what extent it's not the be all and end all, and it's about the rest of life as well.
Sure. And I think I see that through the lens of sexuality as well. I'm a gay man, and I grew up, I came out when I was 17, I think. And I grew up as a teenager, like trying to be straight, pretending to be straight. And that feels like a really long time ago. It is a long time ago. But I'm really proud that I'm married, because I grew up not expecting to even be allowed to get married, and so those things are more important to me. I agree that they are only a part of who I am, but I think celebrating difference is a really important part of diversity. I think it's not about tolerance, it's not about a kind of acceptance, it is about celebration. I expect difference to be celebrated because of the difficulties that often go along with having that difference. It just means more to me to be able to get married and all that kind of stuff than it does to someone who was straight and who grew up straight and always expected to be able to do that.
Yeah, agreed. And it's also interesting looking at the history of disability rights, but I think all of the civil rights struggles that have gone on, that there were certain things that weren't as visible and represented and accepted in society decades or generations ago. And I think for me, I know there was times where there's that word assimilation of sort of trying to fit into whatever normal is. I wonder if there's a more openness and an inclusive nature, that, like you say, the fact that gay marriage is possible, that sort of certain elements are more happening now, and therefore it's easier to have that pride. But then obviously there's still a ton more work to do as well, right?
Yeah. But there's something interesting in that too about visible difference and invisible difference, right? So, as a deaf, disabled person, my impairment is not visible. So I have to come out a lot. I felt like I've done a lot of that as a gay man, and I have to come out as a deaf person as well a lot of the time. And that's really challenging, but it's just a different set of challenges to disabled people's experience who have visible impairments, right? And there are pros and cons to all of those situations, I imagine. There are advantages to me, like passing, to use the kind of trans language of passing as a non-disabled person sometimes, which I guess aren't open to you as a disabled person, right? And I think that's fascinating. Like the visibility and invisibility stuff, I think, is really interesting.
Well, and that's made a bigger surgence, if you like, the last couple of years, because I think there's always this, Joe Public will say, oh, disabled people, wheelchair users. And so I've always been the stereotype of a disabled person. But the stat, you may know the exact stat, but I think it was around 20%-ish was sort of more visible and 80% was invisible. Does that sound about right to you?
That sounds about right. The stat I always remember from our time at Scope was that I think 5% of disabled people are wheelchair users.
Yeah.
That's the stat I always use. I hope I'm right. I think it's definitely based in some evidence, but I think that it helps to kind of explode some of the mythology around disability,
Yeah.
definitely. And of course, there are many disabled people, as we know, who don't identify as disabled people.
Yes.
There was some amazing research that came out when we were both at Scope. I think it was some government research talking about the majority of disabled people who actually identify as people who are ill. Their primary identity is that I'm sick, that I need help with my health, and that and of course that is true of a lot of disabled people who are trying to manage conditions and so on. But I don't know, how do you move towards a space where more and more people are both proud to be disabled people and claim that identity and celebrate that identity, but also are simultaneously getting support for their condition or managing a particular period of time of ill health? They're not opposite. They can be in parallel, but that's complicated stuff, I think.
Yeah, God, there's so many interesting things to go into it. So I don't know where to go next because there's so many things I want to ask you. I mean, bringing it back to your story for a moment, I think that notion around sort of private sector, public sector, third sector, you said you moved sectors, if you like, to NSPCC. It'd be great just to hear a bit more about sort of why you did that, what it was about that opportunity that was interesting for you.
Sure. It's interesting. I think I was in my early 20s, and I felt really frustrated by my experience of working in the private sector. Wasn't motivated by making lots of money, particularly for people who I'd never even met. I was working for some big companies at some times, and I reflected on my childhood experience. My parents were in the army, and they moved all over the world during my childhood. And wherever they moved, they would find a church because they're very religious, but they would also volunteer, and they didn't ever use that language. They didn't call it volunteering, but they would get connected with a local organisation of some kind. And when they were based in London, that was the Star and Garter Home, which is like a kind of massive social care charity for ex-servicemen and women. And it would be other things in other countries. So in Hong Kong, we volunteered for, again, kind of local army charity stuff. But I think that experience growing up, understanding the benefit that you get from being involved in a charity, and just what the social contract is of giving back and getting from having that experience, I just found that really attractive. And I grew up expecting to be an actor. I trained to be an actor and then failed to be an actor. So I came to the thought process of what am I going to do for a career quite late, because the kind of first choice of that didn't work out. And so it felt like a very natural progression to me to I was working in a recruitment company at the time, managing a call center, and it was awful. I didn't enjoy it particularly. And there was a job advertised that day. It so happened to be a Wednesday, so it was Society Guardian, charity jobs. And there was a job going NSPCC in my local community in the East End to help set up a new young people centre. And I just thought, why not give it a go? And I'm so glad I did. It was the best decision I ever made, because I moved from working in the recruitment company was based in Chancery Lane in a big multi-story fancy office with this huge double height story reception, kind of marble floor and stuff. And when I left there on the Friday, and I turned up at the NSPCC on the Monday, working in an East End kind of miniature office building collection of NSPCC projects. The whole thing could have fitted into the reception area of the building I'd left the previous week, but it was full of amazing people doing amazing work, and people who you kind of immediately respected because they were so passionate about what they were doing and why they were doing it. And it was amazing. I learned so much about not just about the work and child protection, but about difference, actually, about diversity. I learned a lot I was working with a group of social workers who really took me under their wing and taught me a massive amount about difference and why difference is good, yeah, I just loved it. I felt like I'd come home. It was great.
Yeah. And then how about with the scope opportunity? How did that all come about?
Well, there was a lot of change going on at the NSPCC, and I've been there for just over 4 years, and it kind of felt like a good time to move on. And stuff was happening at Scope too. There were people I knew were going there to do other jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah, opportunity came up to do a job similar to the one that I was doing at NSPCC, but I just, it felt like a good opportunity to move, but it was so different. Scope was at that time, and this is 2005 when I moved to Scope.
Was it 05 you moved there? Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was, I guess, culturally just so different to the NSPCC. It was much less wealthy. NSPCC at that time felt like it had a lot of money, a lot of support from the public, which I'm sure it still does. But Scope felt like a kind of slightly rougher around the edges, more real organisation. And I arrived, and again, I was really lucky. I arrived, and there were some amazing disabled people working there. I was in a team with Tara Flood and Andy Raquel, and I got lucky with the people who I was kind of put with.
Yeah.
And Tara taught me pretty much everything I know about disability equality, really. And in her own inimitable way, took no prisoners while she was kind of teaching me that stuff. I feel very privileged to have had that experience.
Yeah, she's amazing. I remember I didn't work closely with her because obviously I was more in the fundraising team. But yeah, I just generally remember sort of interactions and even articles she'd written was like, wow, really inspiring.
Definitely. Have you had her on here? You should have her on.
No,
here.
That's someone definitely to get on as well. Yeah. No, that's a good idea. So there's two narratives I wanted to explore, sort of looking at your time at Scope around the time we were both at Scope to now, both the sort of the disability rights and inclusion, sort of how you've seen it evolve, what the issues were then, are they the same now? But also within the charity sense as well. So sort of you could pick which one you want to go down first, but there are two that I'd quite like to explore with you, if that's all right.
Well, the first one I think is particularly interesting for me because I joined Scope, as I said, in 2005. I was already a patient at ENT and audiology, but I didn't identify as a disabled person until I arrived at Sign Health. So I spent 11 years, which is apparently an ordinary amount of time for a deaf person to seek help for their hearing loss. But I spent that whole time identifying as a non-disabled person, and so witnessing disability politics and the changes in the disability community as a non-disabled person, despite the fact that actually my own hearing loss was getting worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
And so there's something really interesting for me about the journey that the community was going on at that time. It was during the period of the UN Declaration, I think, on rights of people with disabilities, and that happened during that time. Scope, had a lot of disabled people working at Scope when I joined, and then that kind of ebbed and flowed during my time there. I perhaps during your time too. The chair of Scope changed, several times during my time at there. So the intensity of the power of disabled people, I think I really witnessed kind of going up and down.
Because I was going to say, sorry to interrupt, James, but just when you were talking earlier about that sort of how the people that were maybe unwell, and then the other people that sort of took the pride in having an impairment, but that dynamic you talked about before, I think Neil Crowther mentioned it on the show. But when we had the austerity after the 2008 crash, and there was the hardest hit March, the movement was spearheaded by people that were like literally weren't getting enough support to live on the most. I mean, it was awful. It was just disgusting to watch it unfold. But I think the consequences that created a big narrative of disabled people and inclusion that isn't the whole situation. You know, there are loads of different parts of the community, but when you just got that intensity fluctuating, there was a lot of intensity around the hardest hit because it was life or death. I mean, it was literally.
And I remember the march, and I remember, as you say, the impact of austerity and all of the welfare decisions that were made. And then I think almost coincidentally, the Olympics and the impact of the Paralympics and how the country saw disabled people. And it was really interesting being at Scope at that time and being able to witness how those conversations were changing. And, you know, I think still we see a narrative of disabled people overcoming their impairment, or, you know, I mean, it's so boring and so annoying. And the older I get, the more frustrated I get, and the less willing I am to just shut up and kind of let it happen, you know. And actually working in an organization now where the majority of my colleagues are deaf, sign language is the predominant language of our work. And, you know, I'm not holding Sign Health up as a kind of paragon of virtue necessarily. I think we have more work to do on diversity in all kinds of ways, but there's something very empowering about the visible and constant difference in the way that we work at Sign Health. You know, our board meetings, where the majority of our trustees are BSL users, it just works differently. And some of the facts of how you work with BSN interpreters and speech to text reporters and so on fundamentally alter the culture of how those things work in brilliant ways, in great ways. And that's about disabled people being empowered, literally being in charge. You know, both my chair and my vice chair are deaf women, and that's an attractive, kind of appropriate form of disability empowerment, I think. And there are so often we see disabled people apparently empowered or apparently in the lead, and that's not really what's happening. My husband works in TV. He develops new TV shows, and I'm forever complaining about how TV treats disabled people, and he's really bored of me going on and on about it. But I think it's begun to leak into him, because he then gets annoyed with other people and his colleagues. So it's working. I'm fighting the good fight even in my own home.
And I guess that's, as you know, when we caught up a few weeks ago and off air catch up, but the Purple Goat stuff is trying to infiltrate the advertising and marketing world, and in and of itself it's an industry, and it's for people working at, it's a career choice. But I think the context of disability inclusion, the context of why I've made that move, is that media, because I think social media is, you know, it's on the rise as a media platform in a, you know, comparison with TV and radio in the past, really. But any form of media, it's just about that representation. And for younger disabled people to have role models doing cool stuff, everyday stuff, not triumph over tragedy stuff, but they're just, you know, lawyers and entrepreneurs and people that travel the world. But it's not like, oh, I overcame it. It's just they love travel, and that's great. I think that's for me a really exciting way of trying to sort of educate society but empower disabled people at the same time. And I would very much speaking to your point about TV advertising, really.
But I think, you know, what I actually saw a conversation about that issue on Twitter yesterday, where a deaf person was talking about the fact that we never see extras, background artists using sign language. You never see it. You know, you're in a kind of a scene in a film which is in a big cafe or whatever, and you never see people in the background using sign language. It never ever happens. And one of the issues we have, I think, in the deaf community is around the visibility of sign language, is around people hearing people who don't want to or need to use sign language, witnessing it peripherally. There's no sign language interpreter at the Prime Minister's briefing.
I know, that was shocking.
Yeah. And Lin Stewart Taylor, a really fantastic deaf woman in the community, has been leading a campaign called #Where is the interpreter? And there is a legal challenge. There is all kinds of work going on that Lin and others have been spearheading, and it's shameful. That there's an interpreter in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland. I think there are actually 2 in Northern Ireland, one for Irish Sign Language, one for British Sign Language.
Wow.
And yet the official response from the petition from the government around Downing Street was that the room isn't big enough. And you think, I mean, is that really is that what we're saying?
Yeah, all the technology as well, right? Like, I mean,
yeah,
there's a million ways you could do it.
I want hearing children to grow up witnessing sign language as normal, as ordinary, as something that happens all the time. But if it's not visible, then it's very difficult for people to be interested in the culture, and it's an amazing culture. I feel very lucky to work for Sign Health and to be part of a part of the deaf community that I wouldn't necessarily be part of. To really work really closely with a lot of people who use sign language as a first language. And there is an amazing community with a really rich history and heritage and culture that needs to be celebrated, to be witnessed by as many people as possible. But it's invisible for most people, and that's desperately frustrating.
Yeah, no, definitely. And in a few minutes I want to ask you a bit more of the sort of specific services and the work going on with Sign Health. I suppose just to that bigger picture, zoomed out thing where we sort of talked about the different sectors, public, private, third sector, sort of what the issues are for disabled people, sort of from 10, 15 years ago up to now. So, I mean, I suppose in terms of the barriers and the issues today, sort of bringing it up to now, I think we've just touched very much on representation and having disabled leaders and empowering disabled people. Just to double check, is there anything else of a broader theme that you feel is very important to push forward?
I think there's something really interesting going on, not just for disabled people, but for other communities too, at the moment, where rights have been hard fought and won, and they're in law, but they're not being manifested. They're not available. So you witness what's going on for the trans community and all of the furore around the Gender Recognition Act. And trans people's rights are established in law as part of the Equality Act. All of this nonsense about people having to identify their gender before they use toilets and things like, none of that is actually real. It's a lie. But there's a debate, there's a way of using the public narrative that betrays the facts. And it's the same for disabled people, whether that's around the UN Convention, whether that's, for deaf people, whether that's around the Accessible Information Standard, which exists in the NHS, which most people who work in the NHS have never heard of, many deaf people have never heard of. These rights have been established. And yet there is, I don't know if it's like a Donald Trump thing, or I don't know where this comes from, but there's this kind of idea that you can just say, well, that's not true. And you can, no, it absolutely is true. It's law, and the narrative shifts, and then people innocently read Twitter or, whatever it might be, and they really get the wrong understanding of the facts. And you see that happening on the attacks on trans people and the attacks on disabled people and hate crime. And of course, those things are interconnected. Trans people can be disabled too. And that's not good. That's where we end up, in Trump's America, in some of the stuff that's happening here in the UK, and if you look at what's happening in Poland for the LGBT community, the path of human rights is not linear. It does not get better and better and better. It can go backwards unless all the right people are doing the right things to continue it moving forward. You know?
And then the C word, as it's now known, the COVID-19. I mean, have you got thoughts on, because I think what you talked about so true, that there's this kind of fake news, dismissing fact, dismissing law. I think there's tribalism, not just party political or countries, but I think I see it even within disability. You've got groups having a pop at each other because it's, they've not got that same alignment of issues and solutions and approaches. And so there's all those kind of things I think you've really well just touched upon and summarized there. Is there a chance that COVID can sort of buck that trend and build a new way going forward?
I hope so. I mean, I'm naturally an optimistic person. I think it's critical to be optimistic, because if you can't be, then there's too much to depress you. You kind of have to see the glass of not only half full, but ready to be filled up any minute now. It's important for us to be optimistic. And I've definitely witnessed a huge amount of interest in working together, to working in partnership, not just in the deaf community, although it's significant in the deaf community. The deaf community has often been quite splintered, particularly in terms of different charities and organizations. And there's a real sense of people coming together more, which is fantastic. But across the disability community, across the whole charity sector, I really witness more collaboration, more compromise. And I think, if we can be more united, then it is easier to try and tell the story. Lots of the work that organizations do is invisible. The whole of social care feels like it's invisible, and yet millions of people are engaged in social care in some way. So we need to make those parts of our country, of our culture, of our community visible and easy to understand, so that people can get behind them. And I think that's more likely as a result of COVID, because people are collaborating. And that, I think change often, that when there's a crisis, then good things can happen despite the awful circumstances of the crisis. And let's not forget, the circumstances still are really awful. And who knows what's yet to come. But I think we have to be optimistic about how that can be a turning point, and how people can come together to find a new way of leading. I think we have to give away a lot more power. You have to be willing to give stuff up and say, okay, that's cool. Actually, really, only these things are really important. I thought it was all of this stuff, but actually it's only this much stuff. That's helpful. Those experiences are helpful, because then you're more ready to compromise. And
it is that such a big community. The numbers are staggering. Like, it really, when we're talking to brands now, they're like, wow, I never knew 14 million people in the UK with a disability. But it's then that how you get that united sort of voice on key issues. Like, of course, back to earlier, we're going to have different interests, different lifestyles, like different economic circumstances, like that. That's sort of generally the human experience. But equally, there is that around inclusion and rights. It feels like there needs to be that sort of, this is the manifesto as a whole block of people. And you could, I'm going to sound like, I was chatting to someone the other day and he started saying I sounded like Che Guevara, but you could topple a government if everyone with disability and families of voted for the party that did the right things by disabled people. That would empower.
Again, I think if we're going to be optimistic and and non-partisan, which is important for me to do as a charity chief exec, of course. But what we witness the government doing at the moment, and again, you can make your own choices about how you view that stuff. But what's interesting is that there's a real response to public opinion. So whether that's about exam results, as we've seen recently, whether that's about school lunches, whether that's about how to respond to COVID, there is a new way we are witnessing, whether it's here or in other countries, where governments are more responsive, more populist, some people might say.
Yeah.
And of course, you're right. If you can channel public opinion and help establish a narrative, a clear story about why something needs to be changed, needs to be different, then you can get public opinion behind you, and hopefully then government to follow suit. So, that there's an opportunity there, definitely. I'm really passionate about social change and the role that charities have to play in delivering on social change.
You read my mind. That was my next question.
But I think, of course, social change is about truly about societies changing, about people understanding things for the first time in a different way, about changing their minds, but probably not just thinking, one day black is black and then black is white. It's not as simple as that. I think often it's about ignorance, and often it's about really witnessing and learning for the first time, and people being involved in that in such a way that goes right. I think one of the disadvantages of the success around the Paralympics, for example, and of course there are many amazingly successful things around the Paralympics, but one of the disbenefits for me is that idea of kind of superhuman disabled people, and that you only count if you can run a marathon, not if you just get up and have a day. And so I think we have to be careful about those narratives that are being created. And of course, the best way to make sure that works well is for disabled people to do it ourselves, for us to be in control of that. But I think there's massive opportunity for social change, because you can see that I grew up in Thatcher's Britain, in literally this lady's not for turning, right, where someone made a decision and they never changed their mind. It was like it was something to be proud of. Whereas perhaps we're entering into a culture where people can change their mind more easily.
Yeah, and it's okay.
I mean, that's a good thing. I think changing your mind is a good thing. If you learn new things and you think, actually, maybe I was wrong, that's a good thing. I don't know that it's necessarily always being delivered in a really practical way, but again, let's be optimistic and let's think about the positives of being able to say, do you know what, we got it wrong and we're going to change our mind. There's huge opportunity for social change there, massive opportunity.
Yeah, and that point about charities' role, because I always have to be very careful when I articulate this point, not for it to come across wrong, because I've worked at a charity. Charities absolutely need to be here to fill in gaps that public-private sector haven't been able to get involved in, etc., etc., etc. I think the difficulty that charities have, particularly in disability, is obviously that being in fundraising in the past, it's that, and it's better now, but it's that older fundraising was please help poor disabled people by donating now. So that was one difficulty of how you get funding in to do great work. And I think also you touched on it earlier about the representation of disabled people at board level and C-suite level at disability charities is something that never used to happen, and it is again now. So I think certain charities have addressed this really well already, and they will benefit from that. But just to get your thoughts on that kind of dynamic of a charity in the disability world, how it can still be forward thinking and dynamic as well.
I mean, I think there's a massive amount still to do. In the charity sector, if you look at the diversity of trustee boards is just appalling. Speaking very generally, I can't recall the exact statistics, but a frightening number of trustees of charities are called I think John or Michael. Like everybody's white. Most people are male. And that's not good, because it continues a very old-fashioned model of what a charity could and should be. I'm really passionate about how we upset that and change it. I think that needs a revolution. That needs radical change. I want to work on boards and work to boards that are truly diverse and that represent a wealth and breadth of diverse experience, and that includes young people who are questioning, why are we doing it like this? Why am I in this boring meeting? Why is this the only way to talk about, you know, the charity's accounts or whatever it might be? I think it needs that challenge from every part of the diversity spectrum, of course, including very much so including disabled people. But I think it is, the difficulty with some of that stuff is that when you've experienced it, when you've worked with, in this case, with lots of disabled people, and you've experienced the genuine wealth that that brings, I become very zealous about why that's such a great thing. But if you're talking to people who haven't had that experience, it's very difficult to articulate it. And of course, the best way of trying to make that happen is to make it happen so that other people can experience it too. But there are a lot of barriers around. You know, there are a lot of boards that don't want to recruit difference. It's scary. They don't understand how to do it. They're worried about making mistakes. And lots of trustees who don't move on. And that's just at board level. Of course, there are all the issues around, you know, senior management and so on too. But there are some people doing some such exciting things in the sector about changing the status quo, and I think it's those people that need to be lifted up and made visible, because change can happen really fast. You know, it doesn't have to follow this, you know, incredibly kind of glacial pace that we've seen around some of the stuff. It can happen overnight. I believe in that. I believe that people can step down. You know, people can say, I'm giving up my trustee, I'm standing back, in order for other people to step forward. I think we need to encourage more of that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Really interesting. Cool. A couple of comments from the viewers. So Al Baraka says, "Hi, how are you doing, brothers? I'm Hassan from Morocco." So global audience today for you, James.
Fantastic.
We've got my cousin David, who is a BSL user, giving a kind of rock on type emoji there. It's great to see David here. Chris saying, I learned sign language. I was amazed at the way there are different regional colloquialisms. Yeah, that's something not a lot of people always know, right, James? That you mentioned about, was it in Ireland where they had the two signers, right?
Yeah, I mean, Irish Sign Language is a completely different sign language to British Sign Language. And I know no Irish Sign Language, so that's the full extent of my knowledge. But yes, British Sign Language has regional differences, for example, in the way that numbers are signed, or days of the week, and also all kinds of different vocabulary signed differently in different parts of the country. It's a rich language, you know, it has a history, and you even begin now to see British Sign Language infiltrated by American Sign Language, where American Sign Language users spell on one hand, whereas in British Sign Language we spell on two hands. But of course, if you're holding a phone and you're on social media and you're recording yourself, it's easier to spell on one hand. So you can begin to see that many BSL users will also use ASL if they're spelling sometimes. So, you know, it's a rich and evolving language the whole time.
Yeah, amazing. And we got Gavin saying, I feel we can miss out the middleman. I think this is referring to government. If disabled people voted with their cash, then we could change the world tomorrow. Any thoughts on that, James?
I mean, I think that's true. We did some work on that at Scope, I think, around you know, the purple pound and the idea of, you know, the buying power of disabled people. I mean, I think that has pros and cons. You know, we know that there are many disabled people who are quite economically disadvantaged, and you know, I think it's important to try and take everybody with us when we're doing that kind of work. And we also know that many disabled people don't identify as disabled people, so it's a very challenging kind of social movement, I think, to be part of, which is good because it means there's lots of opportunity and change to make. But I think we can put our money where our mouths are. You know, there are. I've had talk again about the amazing campaign that Lin Stewart Taylor is running in the deaf community around the interpreters, or the lack of the interpreters at Downing Street. You know, there are individual disabled people putting their money up to support a legal challenge, for example, as part of that. And as far as I know, their most recent crowdfunding target's been reached to do that work. So disabled people are willing to step forward and put their money where their mouths are, absolutely, because it's sadly often that's what makes a difference.
Yeah, that's your point about absolutely. There's higher unemployment, more incidents of poverty with disabled people. I know we were talking to supermarket brands, and I think the point for them, if they move as much for the bottom line, but they also want to do the right thing, and it's sometimes the how, and that's a whole other road we can go down. But the point was that even if the money is coming from a benefit or something, it's still that everyday brands can do a lot more for disabled people, and there will be a business benefit because whether you're in poverty or not, everybody's got the supermarket shop and has a bank account and that kind of stuff. Whereas I think you're right, like talking to a luxury travel brand, that's going to be again, like all of the population, but that's going to be a certain part of the community that it's more relevant for, right?
Yeah, and I think we've seen some of that during COVID. So we've seen, I don't know how much people's understandings will really have shifted, but there've definitely been some interesting debates about why people need to be prioritized for shopping deliveries and those sorts of things. So I think people have had to think about that for the first time. Many non-disabled people have had to think about that for the first time.
Yeah.
We've seen the introduction of face coverings, is a really significant barrier for deaf people.
Yeah.
And basically, there's no significant availability of transparent masks, which you sort of need everybody to be wearing in order for it to be accessible for someone like me.
Someone that is deaf with it, right?
Exactly. So, but then in contrast, I think it was Sainsbury's the other day I saw on Twitter somebody was congratulating them because they'd heard an announcement while they were shopping from Sainsbury's overhead tannoy, I think, saying, reminding people who are shopping, please don't approach people who aren't wearing a mask. There are lots of reasons why people may be exempt from wearing masks. And so all of those opportunities are opportunities to learn, opportunities for people's minds to be shifted slightly, to just nudge people's understanding and to ask and answer questions that many people have never had to confront before. And that's good. It's an opportunity for change, and that's encouraging. But yeah, I think if there's a financial incentive for people to recognize disabled people and celebrate disabled people, then I see that happening in the LGBT community all the time. The contrast between the Pride March I went on in 1994, where people were throwing stuff at us and booing, versus the Pride March that happened last year, where there's rainbow flags over every single shop, every single high street retailer is wearing rainbow flag stuff. There's a big commercial element to that, and there's lots of complexity about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But I think money talks. We have to recognize that there are a lot of disabled people with a lot of spending power. So if you're a clever brand, then you need to be recognizing those differences and reaching out, and that's good. I'm optimistic about more brands doing that better.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Cool. Well, I think the final thing to get stuck into is you mentioned the role now and the stuff you're doing at Sign Health. I think we've covered a lot of general issues and considerations, but really nice to get that sort of from the perspective of the deaf community as well. But yeah, what's sort of going on with the charity at the moment? What kind of initiatives are you working on, James?
Sure. Well, it's an exciting time at Sign Health. We're growing, so we're doing more and more new stuff. We essentially do three things. So we run social care services across the country for deaf BSL users, mostly who people have experienced mental health difficulties. So we have some residential services and some community services. We run the country's only deaf domestic abuse service. So a group of deaf women supporting other deaf people directly in sign language around perhaps leaving a perpetrator and finding a refuge, or support to access court services, or it's a really fantastic service that we're really proud of and trying to grow at the moment. And we provide psychological therapy, again, directly in British Sign Language. So we're the only IAPT provider, that's the NHS approach to improving access to psychological therapy, IAPT. So we're the only IAP provider directly in sign language, and again, that's a national service. And we're seeing more and more people. We had our biggest month ever last month. Amazing team that we have at Sign Health who are delivering that service, and they saw more people last month than ever before, because deaf people are turning to remote technology more and more. It's challenging in sign language. Sign language is three-dimensional, so having a really good interaction in 2 dimensions is different. But I think both my colleagues and the people that we're working with are learning that there are some advantages to that as well as some disadvantages. So we're seeing more and more people using those services. But one of the most exciting things we've done during the pandemic is that we recognized there was a big gap, that deaf people were unable to access their GP, their opticians, their pharmacy, because stuff was closed. People were only available over the phone. So we thought long and hard about how to support deaf people to access healthcare. And of course, we're the health charity for deaf people, right? That's why we exist. So we set up a new service called BSL Health Access, and that's providing access to online interpreters. So 24 hours a day, in any health setting, deaf people and NHS staff who are working with deaf people can use that service to kind of work in a 3-way with an interpreter. So they can have a conversation in somebody's first language around their health. That might be visiting a pharmacy or calling their doctor, or they might be in a COVID ward needing to talk to their consultant. And that's been a huge success. We're now seeing, we have more than 200 calls a day to that service.
Wow.
The difficulty, though, is that we are paying for that service out of our reserves, because we wanted to set it up really fast. We knew that there was a real need in the community, but we're still working with NHS to see if we can get funding from them to sustain the service. But it's been really exciting. It's something we're really proud of.
Yeah, and I think actually for all the talk we've had around different sectors and the sort of ins and outs of disability rights and inclusions, like some of the issues you've touched upon there around sort of need for therapy, domestic abuse, all those areas, it's sad that goes on in the world. As a general, does it have to be that way? But then at the same time, it's phenomenal that you guys are there for that very specific need, and as you say, you're growing because there's more demand, and to imagine a world where the issues are there, the needs there, but there isn't that solution is a scary or even more sad one. So it's testament to you guys for providing the services that you're doing.
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, I'm very proud of the work we do, and I have amazing colleagues who are working really hard every day to deliver those services, and again, many of those services out in the community. So Sign Health staff have been going out to work throughout the whole pandemic. Many of our services are available remotely, like therapy and domestic abuse support, but all of our social care services, Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, London, are all delivered in person. And so I take my hat off to colleagues who have not been working at home and who have been going out to work for Sign Health, and that's incredible. I'm really proud to have my job and work where I work.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, we've got a couple more comments. Nigel says, I think there is a gradual change in inclusion, but it takes so long, which I think you sort of point about the glacial change, but there is always the chance to ignite a spark and to have radical change is possible as well, right?
Yeah, I hope so. And I think sometimes that can come from awful circumstances. If you think about the murder of George Floyd, but also the progress, I hope, that is being made in the Black Lives Matter movement. I think it's about trying to make the most out of really difficult situations, and I think there are opportunities for us to make radical change, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. And Gavin says, best Zoom background ever, I love it. Thanks for a great chat, team.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, this is this is my craft room. When I'm not at work, I'm making things. I like to make things in my spare time. So yeah, this fabric behind me, if that's not obvious.
Okay, cool. And where can people find out more about Sign Health, James?
So our website is signhealth.org.uk, and you can find us on all social media platforms too. And yeah, encourage you to take a look at our website, sign up to our mailing list, and follow us, support what we're doing. And if you need information or advice about deaf people, particularly in health context, then please do get in touch.
Brilliant. Well, that's a wrap, James. Really a pleasure as always to catch up, and we covered a lot of ground. I really enjoyed that conversation. So lovely way to end the week as well. And thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Martin. Great to see you.
Cool. And everyone watching, I hope you've enjoyed today and all the shows this week. Have a lovely weekend. And I will be back again on Monday at noon or just after for the next episode of the Daily Sib. Take care in the meantime. Bye-bye.